It's 1991, and the Soviet Union is fracturing. And down here, another communist party is failing. Yugoslavia, a federation of 6 countries, is ripping itself apart. Their economy is in ruin, and they are replacing communism with nationalism, the kind that thrives on focusing on ethnic and religious differences. By the end of 1991, Croatia, Slovenia, and Macedonia have all declared independence. Macedonia is allowed to leave peacefully, but Slovenia and Croatia fight wars to be independent from Yugoslavia. And then you have Serbia, populated primarily by Christian Serbs, and they were not going to let Yugoslavia fully fall apart. Together with Montenegro, they attempt to become the successor state to Yugoslavia. After all, it was they who held the most power in Yugoslavia, and who comprised the majority of the Yugoslav army. They didn't want independent states. They wanted to hold on to their majority, to their power. Another country in this crumbling federation was the Socialist Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Almost half of this country were Bosnian Muslims, called Bosniaks, and about a third were Christian Serbs, similar to the Christian Serbs living up here but living in Bosnia. The other 17% were Croats. For a long time, these groups had lived side by side in relative peace. They had a common ideology, communism, the idea of Yugoslavia. But as all these new countries were being created, no one wanted to end up in a new nation controlled by the other side. So it's late 1991, and a largely Croat region declares itself an independent state from Bosnia. It wasn't recognized internationally. While some Croat leaders want to secede from the country entirely, they first agree to cooperate with the government of Bosnia and Herzegovina, acting like a state within a state. The next year, Bosnia holds an independence vote. 63% of the population turns out, and the results are that 99% of the voters say yes, they want to be independent from Yugoslavia. These numbers imply that it was mostly Bosniaks that voted, with the Bosnian Serbs boycotting the vote, as most were against becoming a minority in a new Bosnia. So after the independence vote passed, the Bosnian Serbs declared their own state within the borders of Bosnia. It was called Republika Srpska. No one recognized this new self-declared country, besides one, and it was the one that mattered. Serbia and Montenegro now had this leader, an important part of the story. His name was Slobodan Milosevic. He recognizes the new Serb state within Bosnia, and this marks the start of the Bosnian War. Pummeled it anyway. The UN quickly attempts to negotiate with Milosevic and Serb forces, and they reach a quick agreement to withdraw the Yugoslav army. But what really happens is the Yugoslav army just gives up control of around 100,000 Serb troops, who mostly continue fighting for the Serbs in Bosnia. As Yugoslav forces withdraw from Sarajevo as part of this agreement, the retreating forces are attacked by Bosniak troops. An unknown number of Yugoslav army personnel are killed. Bosniak commanders would later be charged with war crimes for this attack. As the war rages on, Serbs escalate the brutality all over the country, routinely identifying Bosniak homes, ransacking and burning them down, rounding up civilians, separating the men from the women, and sending the men to concentration camps or executing them. Women are sent to prisons where they suffer abuses and human rights violations that I'm not going to describe here for how atrocious they are. You can go to the sources for details. The point here is that what the Serbs are doing is starting to look like an ethnic cleansing of the land they claimed. Meanwhile, the international community is hesitant to get too involved beyond cutting off the Yugoslav economy with sanctions, and the UN sends food, medicine, and peacekeeping soldiers. They also cut off the flow of weapons from the outside. But the UN mostly sticks to its peacekeeping principles, not interfering in the conflict, not stopping the advance of the Serbs or the ongoing ethnic cleansing that has begun. But the situation in Bosnia is getting worse. The alliance between Bosniaks and Croats is falling apart. They start fighting each other. So now Bosniak forces are fighting the Serbs on one side and their former allies, the Croats, on the other. A war within a war. As this new complicated stage of the conflict starts, Croat forces surround and begin an attack in the city of Mostar, a city that the two had once defended together back in 1992 against the Serbs. Croat forces capture large portions of the city. They blow up Bosniak mosques and murder Bosniak civilians in their wake. Things are getting bad, and in response to these worsening conditions in Bosnia, the UN gets NATO forces to come to Bosnia to enforce a no-fly zone, basically committing them to shoot down any planes flying over the country. But this does nothing to stop the ethnic cleansing that continues to escalate on the ground. So the next year, the UN establishes safe zones across the country to protect civilians fleeing the war, particularly Bosniaks, who are fleeing ethnic cleansing by the Serb armies. But the UN is only as powerful as its member nations are willing to let them be. And it turns out member nations are not willing to commit enough troops to actually fortify these safe zones. Serb forces regularly show up and attack the civilians in these safe zones. The United States, who's still trying to stay out of this war, helps negotiate peace between the Croats and the Bosniaks, thus ending the war within the war. They sign an agreement in March of 1994, re-establishing the Federal Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And most importantly, they renew their alliance to fight against the Serbs. Things slowly start to change in 1994. Bosnian Serbs decline a peace deal offered by the UN. In response, Milosevic, who's now feeling the consequences of being cut off from the global economy, now cuts ties with the Bosnian Serbs, refusing to send them more weapons and money. He wants to remain in power, controlling his new Yugoslavia, and hopes that cutting ties with the Bosnian Serbs who are doing all these terrible things will convince the West to begin trading with him again. So Milosevic's support is now gone, but even still, the Bosnian Serbs continue their campaign of horror, committing atrocities all over the country. But it's not just the Serbs. Bosniaks and Croats have also devolved into committing terrible, violent human rights abuses against civilians. As the war rages on, NATO continues to enforce their no-fly zone, shooting down a Serb jet and getting more and more pulled into this conflict as Serb forces get bolder. Former President Jimmy Carter travels to Bosnia and negotiates a 4-month ceasefire. It mostly holds, with a few exceptions, but the ceasefire expires. They can't agree on a new one, and the fighting starts again. Serb forces are able to steal heavy weapons from the UN and then use them to kill civilians. NATO continues to ramp up airstrikes. Serb forces respond by taking UN peacekeepers hostage and shooting down a US F-16. Serb forces are feeling emboldened at this point. They have consistently held around 70% of the land in Bosnia, and even pushed back UN peacekeepers without major consequences. And they see an opportunity for one last big offensive to end the war and secure all of this land. They just need to take over the UN safe zones, kick the UN out, and then take Sarajevo with overwhelming force. So they target the town of Srebrenica, a UN safe zone where nearly 10,000 Bosniaks are seeking refuge. The UN had taken away their weapons. They were totally unarmed, but protected by UN forces. On July 11, 1995, 2,000 Serb soldiers march into the town. They meet no resistance from the UN soldiers, who decided to maintain their neutrality and defend supplies and food for their refugees, instead of the people themselves. But these UN soldiers were really just 370 Dutch soldiers. They were outmatched anyway, so some retreat, others are captured. The Serb forces then round up 8,000 Bosniak men and boys, and then they systematically execute them, comprising the deadliest genocide on European soil since World War II. Surviving refugees, abandoned by the international community, flee the violence in Srebrenica. They fled to other areas, telling the stories of this mass murder. The UN would later report that all sides violated the Geneva Conventions, but described the Serb offensive as, quote, systematic ethnic cleansing. And at this point, the United States can no longer stand by and watch this happen. So in late 1995, the Clinton administration pursues a new strategy. They plan for the UN to eventually pull out of Bosnia. The US and NATO would keep them safe. The plan also ensured that the US would be allowed to send weapons to the Bosnian government. The US then proposed a peace plan, one that divided Bosnia into two entities, one for Serbs and one for Bosniaks. These regions would have some autonomy, and Bosniaks would control 51% of the country. Both sides considered the US's plan, but the fighting continued. But now, with the international community squarely on their side, the Croats conduct a successful offensive in 1995 that takes back significant land from the Serbs, and the Bosniaks gain momentum in the war. The balance of power is shifting. which forces the Serbs back to the negotiating table to cut their losses. After many rounds of negotiation, and with the Serb forces seeing the tide of the war turn against them, the Dayton Accords are signed in December 1995 by the presidents of Croatia, Bosnia, and Serbia.
On behalf of all of us who would come to see this peace take hold, you have seen what war has wrought. You know what peace can bring.
It was this agreement that eventually gave us these modern borders that divide the country into two. You have the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is composed mostly of Bosniaks and Bosnian Croats, and over here the Republika Srpska, composed mostly of Bosnian Serbs, which is somewhat independent with its own political system and its own judiciary, but it's still a part of Bosnia and Herzegovina. So the war is over. Around 100,000 people died during this violence.
That was The Worst War You Never Learned About by Johnny Harris, covering a single aspect of the obstructed damages from the withholding of David Bull's character, which acknowledges in the secret court records that the UN officials had contacted David in order to assist in the negotiation of the settlements, which they specifically restrained David from doing. At which point the position is the UN's exponential position of subverting the former Soviet Union's insurance and its various advantages, which David would have maintained, and with the acknowledgement of what he was owed without the obstructions. The understanding is that the various nations around the world would have formed their colonies in the preparation of the states, which meant that David would have already had his insurance markets up and running by these times, as well as many states from the treaties carved out from each government territory with the treaty, at which point the economic treaty actively exchanging with the society holding the treaty means that those seeking to serve under David would have already actively been prepared to do so, and David, having been restrained from his engagements, would not have been able to have finalized his insurance structure with the former Soviet Union, which would have acknowledged the inevitability of these types of breakups, allowing for him to have finished a series of insurance protocols against the catastrophic collapses, generically referred to as the zombie insurance, or the zombie apocalypse insurance, which is the assumption of the complete collapse of society, at which point you have these systems which would have been arranged. And the engagement of this starting out would have been foreseen in those preparations before the Soviet Union would have dissolved its control over those specific areas, allowing for David to have finalized his state within that area of the minority which they aggressed against, and the acknowledgement of the aggression being funded by a foreign entity from that point indicates the natural reaction from all of the various agents, such as the acknowledgement that David was going to initiate against the foreign invader. And with the destruction of the foreign invader, he would have collected the total overarching territories, at which point he, having already finished the mechanism of the state for that area, would have collected the larger area, at which point it would have systematically increased the amount of investments that it would have received in order to increase the insurance mechanisms, which David would have actively enforced with more troops or more security agents, increasing the risk management based society, the insurance-based society, the preservation-based society, actively seeking the protocols and the subversion against these potential threats, with David completely in control, actively dissolving the tensions by the use of increased obligation trades, at which point you have the systems which would have resolved the general interest of what would have been the most productive means to continue, which could have gone in any which way to settle in its final version, at which point the assumption that this is true is the acknowledgement that the UN wanted to restrain David so that they could use him as a bludgeoning weapon, or the threat of the use of David as a bludgeoning weapon, which would have systematically removed the most interesting parts about the character and his ability to influence diplomatic solutions by the obligation for him to be subordinated to his inferiors, generating the position of their exponential acceleration in status and importance by the suppression of David's status and importance, for the increasing of the problems by the systematic disillusionment of real solutions. And as they have historically known that these strategies would fail, they are not implementing a new strategy on how to succeed. They are implementing an old strategy they know will collapse. At which point you have these systems of retaliations, which they allow for their propagandists to gain the superiority position from the outside world, which gives them the leverage of being false moral superiors, and replace it with the active engagement of the criminal subversions, which they are subtly amplifying by intentionally conducting the frauds for the disillusionment of any real solution, which includes the Confederate prompting against the Russians at its eventual date, which was known from the beginning as an interest of the Confederacy to force Russia to invade in Ukraine so that they could support Ukraine in killing Russia inside the meat grinder that is the proxy war, because the interest is the net outcome of total evil against the targeted groups, at which point the subject is a question of a war of attrition until all of the systems collapse by virtue of exhaustion, which is the historic strategies from the record, at which point the security protocols being enforced can be settled in the governance question in any which way. And since David would have already been sending the insurance supplies against the catastrophic threats, such as the food supplies and medical supplies and other essentials, the activity of its investment into that state would have allowed for the specific amplification of those solutions within the exponentially reduced damages from the reduced time it took in order to have solved the problem. Now, the answer is that they directly believed this as a mechanism of David engaging in the use of military actions, as the position that they were trying to acquire is the development of the Antichrist, which has to be able to build the temple. And as we all know, David was not able to build the temple because his hands were too bloody, and that it had to be given to his son, at which point that would screw with their timeline if David's character, similar to the social and religious functions inside biblical religions, would have not been able to have built the temple, and thus he could not be the Antichrist, which is an exponential threat to their total ambitions, which forced them to give up on that specific possibility for the use of funneling him into the Antichrist ritual, exponentially ginning up the various threats through the alternatives, which led to the severe abuses against him and others through their unrepentant war crimes and dedication to fraud by refusing to publicly acknowledge their most fundamental beliefs about reality of the state of the world and how the alignment of power and authority is qualified under their investigation of law.